Stop memorizing 20 moves of theory and learn these 24 unique positional ideas that will take your London system to a near master level. This video will cover minimal theory and instead focus on positional concepts and common mistakes. Plus, several of these ideas have never been covered anywhere else on YouTube, so stay tuned for that. London system is one of the most popular openings in chess, and it is characterized by having this bishop on f4 and by this pawn pyramid right here with c3. So this is a typical London structure for the white pieces, and this is one of the most active ways for black to play. We will discuss plenty of different variations, of course, but let's start with this one. And the idea that I'm trying to highlight is that in the London system, you need to control the e5 and the e4 squares. This is necessary so you stop your opponent's counterplay. Now, what happens when we don't control these squares? Let's say our opponent plays bishop to d6. We will take the bishop, and after queen takes d6, we play this move bishop to d3. Looks very natural, right? What could be wrong here? But remember, when we made this exchange, we relinquished our control over this e5 square because this also helped the queen develop. Queen also supports this e5 pawn advancement. So now black can play e5, and what happens is that after we capture on e5 and make a bunch of trades in this position, even after king to f8, black has no problems because white did not put any pressure on the black pieces. Even when the king goes to f8, this is completely equal and completely fine for the black pieces. White has no pressure here. Similarly, you also need to control this e4 square. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to show you a different variation. For example, this is the copycat variation where your opponent plays bishop to f5, copying white's bishop to f4. In this variation, black is aiming to control this e4 square instead of the e5 square. And similarly, when black manages to control this square, your play is kind of shut down, and it's very, very difficult to generate something from this position because you simply don't have anything. The knight on e4 is extremely active and you're struggling to get rid of it. For example, if you take it with the pawn, you get forked, you lose the game. If you take it with the bishop, then after pawn takes, you have just lost the bishop pair, and the light square bishop is one of the most powerful attackers for the white pieces. So you traded that off, which is of course beneficial for the black side. So in reality, you want to play in a way where you control both of these squares. Now, there are some variations where, of course, black will try to contest one of these two squares, but if you manage to take control of them, and let's say you get into a position like this, you're going to be able to put tremendous amount of pressure on your opponent, and we're going to see that idea very, very soon. One of white's main ideas in the London system is to get a huge kingside attack going on, and controlling the e5 square is very, very important for that. In this position after knight to e5, what we are really trying to do is actually we're trying to blockade this square completely so our opponent is never able to play e5. And if our opponent will never play e5, that means he will never be able to develop the bishop this way, and that means that it's going to be easier to attack the black king, especially when we continue developing and our opponent takes on e5. This is really bad for the black pieces because we will take back with the pawn, and now we are still blockading the e-pawn, which means that this bishop simply cannot come here to defend the king, but also the pawn on e5 kicks out the knight on f6, one of the most important defenders of this king. So now the knight has to move, and now you can start to attack this king with moves like h4. Let's say opponent plays f5, you can go g4, and you can just hammer away at the position, and there is not a lot that your opponent can do. Let's say black tries something like queen to b6, we will go g takes f5, e takes f5, and then we will go c4, and we are generating an insane attack on this black king, and it is very difficult for black to defend. Black has to play this move g6, and then we will go queen h6, and slowly but surely we will continue to bring our pieces, and we will continue to create some initiative either down the g file or potentially the h file also. So in this case, for example, knight to f8 can be played. We can queenside castle, let's say bishop to e6 by our opponent, and we can go pawn to h5 and keep hammering away at this black king, and black is not feeling safe in this position whatsoever. Now, when black is unable to contest either the e5 or the e4 squares, the main plan for black will be to actually play on the queen side with moves like pawn to c4, and then trying to generate play with b5, and then let's say white counterattacks in the center, and then b4 for the black side. So what black wants to do is open up the queen side and try to attack over there with moves like queen to a5 and target the weak pawn on c3, and white will push the pawn to e5, and white will try to generate some play on the king side. Now, this position may look dangerous for black, but if you defend this carefully, according to the computer, you're actually slightly better from the black side. You need to continue developing, obviously. You need to take on c3 at some point, and white might try to play something like g4. You will move the bishop back. This trade might happen. You can even take with the f pawn in order to open up your rook here, and then play queen to a5, pressuring the queen side. Now, this might sound weird to a lot of you, but this position is actually much better for the black pieces because black has all the pressure on the a2 pawn, on the c3 pawn, and white is actually struggling to generate an attack on the black king and also struggling to defend these pawns at the same time. A very common scenario in the London system is for black to play this move bishop to d6, contesting the bishop on f4. Now, in these types of situations, you do not want to take the bishop on d6 because that helps the black queen develop. And remember what we talked about earlier, we want to control the e5 square, and allowing the black queen to develop actually helps black because black is faster and black can execute e5 in order to solve his problems. Now, instead of that, a very common way to deal with this move bishop to d6 is to actually go bishop to g3, and this way you're basically refusing to take on d6 because this trade is not beneficial for you as the white side, and if black takes you, trying to sort of brute force trading off the bishops, in this case you will take back with the h pawn, you will open up the h file, and if black castles, this will allow you to generate lots of attacks on this black king with moves like bishop to d3, and let's say bishop d7, you can go knight e5, you can go g4, g5, and this is an extremely dangerous position for the black pieces already. So most of the time black will not take the bishop on g3, black might castle instead, and then you will continue developing. But remember that if they trade, that benefits you. If not, then you want to contest this e5 square, and that brings me to my next point. In a lot of lines, you can plop this knight into e5, and what you can do is actually you can reinforce this knight with pawn to f4. This is what's known as the stonewall structure, and it is very, very solid for the white pieces in this case, especially because usually in the stonewall, this bishop is on c1. But in this case, this bishop is on g3. That means it's an improved version of the stonewall because we will easily be able to go bishop to h4 later on in the game. Even if the knight moves, it's still good to move this bishop over here to control some dark squares on this diagonal. And if black decides to play something like f6, in this case, we have queen h5 with monstrous attacks on the king. And if the black knight stays here, let's say black plays a5 instead or something like this, you know, we can go bishop h4 anyways, and we can always trade off our bad bishop for this knight, because after f4, this is sort of a bad bishop. It's not really doing anything on g3 anymore, so it's better to move it away, trade it off at some point. You don't have to do it immediately, and then you can still continue attacking on this side of the board with ideas such as queen f3, queen h3, for example. This is one of the most common attacking ideas in the London, and it is a very simple plan that you can always go for. There are some lines where after black plays pawn to c4 and you drop your bishop back, you can actually allow your opponent to take you on f4. So for example, after knight to f3, let's say bishop takes f4, e takes f4, this is actually a really good position for the white pieces despite the doubled pawns. That is because this pawn on f4 is actually very helpful in terms of controlling the e5 square and not allowing this pawn break. So this is a very nice position for the white pieces, and white doesn't have any problems here. Even if black tries something like, let's say, queen to c7 targeting this pawn, you can go knight to e5, and if they take on e5, you go fe5, and at this point after queen g4, you're almost winning already. This is such a dominant position for the white pieces. You have h4, h5, you have knight f3 to bring the knight over here, and this is a very, very nice position. It doesn't look like it, it doesn't feel like it yet, but this position's actually almost +2. So going back in these types of scenarios, when black plays c4, you can actually allow your opponent to take on f4. But if black plays bishop d6 immediately, in this situation, you don't want this trade. You actually either want to drop the bishop back or you want to take on c5, but you don't want them to take you, because after knight to f3, if they take you, now this pawn has not been committed to c4. So black can take on d4 instead, create an isolated pawn on d4, and then go queen b6, targeting b2, targeting d4. You can try to defend with knight to b3, but black has very nice pressure on this pawn on d4, and this is just a very nice position for the black pieces. So whenever your opponent commits the pawn to c4, he can no longer take on d4, he can no longer create an isolated pawn for you. So in these types of situations, you can allow them to take on f4, and this actually improves white's position significantly. Another thing that you have to remember with the white pieces, when black commits the pawn to c4, you have to remember that you have two main pawn breaks in the position with the white pieces. One pawn break is this one, pawn to b3, and another pawn break is pawn to e4. Now with pawn to b3, what you're trying to accomplish here is that you're trying to pressure this pawn, and actually you are threatening to win it, so the only move here is to take on b3 for the black pieces. But this allows you to take back with a pawn, and this is very good for white because white activates the rook on the a file. Now this rook activates a little bit, and then you can also consider moves like pawn to c4, not immediately because there's always knight to b4, but you have this central pawn break down the road as well. Another pawn break that you have to consider for the white pieces is this move pawn to e4. Now pawn to e4 is very useful for white because in a lot of lines you can advance this pawn to e5 and try to create some attacks on the king side, or you can keep the tension and open up the position at some point. The choice is really yours. It's really situational. Like in this case, it's actually a really good move to play e5 and then force the knight back, and then you can continue developing. And if your opponent castles, then you still can continue with a move like b3, and basically you have this attack on the black king. So you got rid of the pawn on c4, and now you're going bishop d3, you're attacking the pawn on h7. Let's say h6 is played, all of a sudden g4, g5 is coming, and the g file is opening up. So London can be very, very aggressive in a lot of positions, and in order to fully activate your position, you need the b3 pawn break, and you also need the e4 pawn break as well. A very interesting way to transform the structure is when you play bishop d3 and let's say black takes you. Of course, black doesn't have to do this, but sometimes they will. And when they do, you can actually take back with the pawn. Remember how we talked about earlier that you want to control the e4 square, and this is one of the main squares you want to control with the white pieces in order to stop black's counterplay? Well, the pawn on d3 actually helps with that. And after you get the pawn to d3, you can go queen b3, and at some point what will happen is that you will strike in the center with e4, and this is very, very useful as well. Now you don't have to do this, it depends on what black does, but this is a possibility that I wanted to show you anyways. It's a very interesting approach to the position, and if you get the opportunity to transform the structure in this manner right here, remember that it's quite decent, it's very solid for white, and it controls the e4 square, so it's easier to execute the e4 pawn break. Now listen closely, because I'm about to share with you one of the most important ideas in the London. Masters, of course, know about this idea, but a lot of casual players don't seem to know about this idea, and it's actually one of the best ways for black to fight back against the London. And that idea is actually knight to h5. Now the goal here is to trade off the knight for the bishop. Very, very simple. You want to get the bishop pair, and this is actually a massive positional threat. Now the best way for white to deal with this is to actually play bishop to e5 first. If knight takes on e5, knight takes, or actually pawn takes, both of these are possible. And I'm not going to go into heavy details here, but this has been known to be fine for the white pieces, because the pawn on e5 is very annoying and the knight cannot get back to f6, so it's kind of stuck here on this square. So you have to be very careful with black. You can analyze this more if you want to. The main way to deal with this is f6 and then to take on g3, but the problem is that if you play f6, this diagonal becomes a little bit weaker, so it's just a way for white to induce a slight weakness and then utilize the fact that g6 cannot be played because of bishop to d3. Right here, there's a pin on the h file, so bishop to g6 is a threat, and this is an uncomfortable position for the black pieces. So this is one of the ways that white can try to make black's life a little bit worse by playing bishop to e5 and inducing f6. But a lot of players here go straight up back to g3, which is incorrect, or they go bishop to g5, which is actually even worse, because there's h6 and g5, and then black takes on g3. And here, once again, black has the bishop pair and black is positionally better. This is not a type of position you want if you are a London player and if you're playing with the white pieces, okay? So you always have to be mindful of this knight to h5 move. That's why actually knight to f3 is considered an inferior move order in this position, and we will talk about move orders slightly later as well. But you can play h3, you can play knight to d2, but in this position knight d2 is the most common move because queen still maintains vision on h5, so you cannot do this. So you have to remember that this knight h5 idea is not only relevant in this d5 c5 system, it's also relevant in a lot of other systems. So I can show you a completely different setup for the black pieces. This is the Queen's Indian setup with b6 and e6, but the problem here is that after bishop to e7, once the knight moves away, black is controlling g5. You don't necessarily want to go knight h5 immediately with black because there's bishop g5, and if you play bishop e7, bishop takes e7, queen e7, this is not exactly what you want. It's still fine, but you don't want to trade off bishop for bishop. You want to trade off knight for bishop. So usually it's wise to start with a move like bishop to e7 first, and now knight to h5 is an actual positional threat. The most commonly played move in this position in the Masters database is this move pawn to h3, and this is a very wise move because after knight to h5 there's bishop to h2, so h3 creates a getaway square for the bishop, and then white is totally fine here. But going back, what you don't want to do is play a very natural move such as, for example, pawn to c3, or you don't want to play something like bishop to d3 because this allows knight to h5, and now you cannot go to g5 because of course this would hang the bishop. You can try bishop e5, but it doesn't do anything because there's d6. In this case, the pawn is not on d5, so knight to c6 doesn't have to be played to go after the bishop or anything like that. You can just kick the bishop back to g3, and of course the pawn on g7 is defended, by the way. Knight takes g7, so keep that in mind. A lot of people blunder this bishop for some reason on g7 when they don't have to. So white in reality should go back to g3, but in this case you can just play something as simple as g6. You don't even have to take immediately. You can wait for white to castle and then you take on g3 and the rook doesn't open up. And g6 is already a useful move because you can play bishop to f6, you can castle, and then you can pressure the center with something like c5. So this setup right here is extremely solid for black, and black is even better due to the bishop pair. So keep this idea of knight h5 in mind, because it is relevant in literally every single setup in the London system. This is one of the best ways for black to equalize the game against the London and even achieve a positional advantage. So if you're playing London from the white side, you do not want to allow a move like knight to h5. A very interesting idea that you have with the black pieces is to play bishop to e7, and you're threatening knight to h5 here. So for example, if a very natural move bishop to d3 is played, you can play knight to h5 going after this bishop. We already talked about this. If this bishop goes to g5, that hangs the bishop. So white in these positions plays h3 to create a getaway square on h2. But now what you can do is you can actually play this ludicrous move bishop to d6. And I swear I'm not making this up. This has been played by top players, by Magnus, by Fabiano, by Hikaru. This position has been played by many top grandmasters. And remember how earlier we talked about this idea. When the bishop goes to d6, white can play this move bishop to g3. And you don't necessarily want to take on g3 because that helps white open up the h file. Well, if you go bishop to e7 first and you bait out h3, now you can go bishop to d6, and white cannot go back to g3 because you take and ruin white's structure completely. So white is kind of incentivized to take on d6, and then eventually black might try to set up e5, or black will go b6, bishop e7. There are a couple of options, and there are a couple of different things you can do here from the black side. Now, this is not a perfect idea. There are some ways to counter this. For example, the main line here after bishop to d6 is to take on c5 and then go bishop to d3 with white. And at this point, this position is equal. You play some chess, and you should be trying to play moves like queen e7. Try to get e5 if you can. Most likely your opponent will not allow you to do that. But this is an equal position according to the engine, and it's very solid for black. So black does not really have any issues once you are able to put this bishop on b7. So remember this very weird but an interesting idea to go bishop to e7, bait out h3, and then go bishop d6 in order to incentivize the exchange of the bishops. And if white trades, this is going to be very comfortable for the black pieces. One of the most challenging ways that black can play against white in the London is to play c5, and c5 does two things. First of all, c5 pressures the center immediately, and secondly, it opens up the diagonal for the queen, so the queen can go to b6, pressuring b2. And since we played bishop to f4, the b2 pawn is no longer defended, so this is an actual weakness that you have to deal with the white pieces. So let's say after knight to f6, we go knight f3, knight c6, c3, queen to b6 can be played, and this goes into one of the most theoretical variations in the London system. But of course, we're not going to talk about too much theory. We are going to deconstruct ideas here very soon. A very important positional idea that you have to keep in mind is that when your bishop with the black pieces is already developed to b7, you do not want to take on d4 and transform the position into a Carlsbad structure. Now, why is that? Let me go back briefly and let me explain what white's plans are in this position. So main pawn breaks for white are either c4 or e4. Most of the time in the London system is actually going to be e4. So what will happen here is that after a couple of moves, I know I'm skipping forward, but I'm just trying to highlight an idea. White will end up playing either e4 or c4 at some point, which will open up this bishop. If e4 is played, of course, the pawn will take, the bishop opens up. If c4 is played, pawn will take, bishop opens up. Same thing. But if I go back in this position, if black plays c takes d4, after e takes d4, the position transforms into a Carlsbad structure. And in this structure, white is not incentivized to play c4. So white will not be playing c4, white will be playing in the center of the board. And that means that the pawn will remain on d5 pretty much forever. So this is a bit of an advanced concept, but bear with me here because this is one of the biggest positional mistakes you can make. And also, not only the pawn will remain on d5, b5, this bishop is completely misplaced, because in the Carlsbad structure, in positions like these, you want to go for a minority attack. You want to go for b5, a5, b4. But how are you going to set that up? Are you going to slow play it with a6, b5? You cannot play rook b8 because the bishop is on f4 to support the b pawn advancement. And even if you were able to play rook b8 to support the b pawn, you would have to move the bishop. So this is a very uncomfortable version of the Carlsbad for the black pieces. That is why you never want to take on d4 and transform the position into this structure when your bishop is already on b7. You want to keep the tension as much as possible and wait for white to execute one of the pawn breaks, e4 or c4, which will eventually open up your bishop. So this bishop right here is very well placed on b7, but if you take on d4, it's very poorly placed on b7. So this is an interesting way to look at this structure. One of the most common scenarios that you will face in the London system is when black plays this move queen to b6, targeting b2. There is this move queen to b3, and this is a queen standoff that you're going to have to deal with in a lot of lines. Now, queen to b3 is not the only move. For example, you can play something like queen to c2. This allows a whole new set of theoretical ideas. There's even a move like bishop to f5 in this case, sacrificing the bishop because then the rook will be hanging after the queen takes on b2. So there are even ideas like this. So a very common move for white is to play queen to b3, and what you have to know in this scenario is that neither side really wants to take each other. So for example, black doesn't want to take white because this helps white open up his rook. And when black plays c4, white doesn't want to take on b6 because that helps black open up his rook. So you're left with this sort of a standoff, and neither side wants to take each other. So actually after c4, the most played move is actually not to take on b6, it's to go back to c2, and after bishop to f5, it's to go back to c1. So remember that neither side wants to take each other in the queen standoff. Now there is one exception that you have to remember in these types of positions, and that is that if queen to b3 is played, in this case queen b6 is actually wrong. The correct move is queen c8, but a lot of people play queen to b6. And in this case, it's actually good for white to take on b6 because the bishop immediately develops to b5, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on the knight on c6. Now there's a massive difference here, and I will actually illustrate what that difference is. So this is the position that we were talking about earlier, and in this case, when black plays c4, white doesn't want to take, because in this case, white cannot get the bishop to b5. But if we look at a position when black gets the bishop out, like this, bishop to g4, after c3 and e6, this gives white enough time to go b3 and the queen to go to b6, but black doesn't have enough time to play c4. So white takes immediately and then goes bishop to b5. So in this case, this is one of the exceptions when white actually wants to take on b6. So now let's go back to this position. Why is this capture bad for the black pieces? So after something like queen b3, a b3, in this position, what happens is that if you play a move like e6, that blocks out the bishop. And if you play something like, let's say, bishop to f5, that hangs the pawn. So most people in this position will take on d4 and then they will go bishop to f5 to avoid hanging the pawn. But in this case, this actually allows you to use your doubled pawn. So you can use this pawn to go b4. And what's funny is that you want to play b5 and it looks like a6 stops b5, but it doesn't. You can go b5 anyways, and if pawn takes, there's rook takes rook. So the rook is hanging in the corner and the pawn is technically pinned, so the knight has to go back and then knight b to d2 by white, and white gets a very, very nice active position, bishop to b5, and if knight to d7 is played, there's knight e5, winning the game immediately. So this is just a completely winning position for white if black isn't careful, and black being careful means that black has to play king d8, and this is just, I mean, this is terrible. It's already +2, and I mean, this is just such a dominant position for the white pieces. So you can actually use your doubled b pawn to attack your opponent. After c4 and this queen trade, black also wants to use his doubled b pawn in order to attack white. So in this case, after knight b to d2, b5, a3, black can actually play this move pawn to b4. And we can play this with black because the a pawn is once again pinned and the rook on a1 is undefended. So from here, let's say c takes b4 is played, knight takes b4, and rook to c1. The knight will simply go back, but now the other pawn, the other b pawn, can join the attack. And what tends to happen in these types of positions is that eventually black will end up playing b4. I know I just skipped a lot of moves ahead, but of course you have to set this up. You will play b4 a second time, and the second time you play it, after takes, there's rook a2 coming, and this pawn will be potentially weak in the future. If you play something like rook to a1, king e7, let's say knight to f3, black is slightly better here due to the superior pawn structure, because this pawn in a lot of lines can be weak, although it's not quite decisive yet. You still need to improve your position, but it is still very comfortable for the black side. And the idea of pushing the b pawn in order to create weaknesses still exists for black. In order to stop black from playing b4, white sometimes plays this move rook to c1. And in these types of positions, what you can do is play this very, very cool and very strange maneuver, knight to d7, knight b6, and knight a4. This is super cool because once the knight gets to the a4 square, it pretty much pressures b2 and c3 forever. And of course, you kind of have to play pawn to b3 in order to defend this pawn, since you cannot defend it with the rook right now. And after you play this, after pawn takes and knight takes, there's actually this move pawn to e5, opening up the bishop. Even though you're giving up this pawn, you are going to win one of these two pawns back. There's f6 here. You don't want to take on c6 with the white pieces, so you end up going back. But there's bishop takes a3, winning the pawn back. And this is once again a slightly more comfortable position for the black pieces. It looks like black might be in some trouble because of the really atrocious pawn structure. However, black makes up for that by having really strong bishops and a really strong knight on a4, pressuring c3. So despite the fact that these pawns are terrible, black has enough activity to make up for it. A very interesting idea that actually applies to both sides is to expand with g and h pawns. So in a lot of these lines, white can play h3, g4, and black can play h6, g5. So for example, I'm going to show this from the black side, I suppose, when black plays h6, and after a move like castles, there's g5, bishop to g3, and the idea here is to take space on the king side. Of course, you're not necessarily going to be checkmating the white king. The queens are off the board, and it's pretty much impossible to get a checkmating attack, but you can play g4 in a lot of lines, force the knight to h4, where it will oftentimes be kind of stuck and very uncomfortable on this h4 square. So for example, after something like bishop to f4, there's already knight to e4 attacking this knight on h4, and after knight takes e4, bishop e4, the rook also attacks it. So if you play a move like g3, it doesn't matter because bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes, all of a sudden there are some serious checkmating threats, and this is a completely winning position for the black pieces. So this idea of h6 and g5, let me just go back to this position right here, h6 and g5, it's not winning automatically. I just showed a line that was good for black, but it's positionally good because you're taking space on the king side, and there's really no downside to it. Since the queens are off the board, you don't need to worry about weakening your king. There is a really cool piece sacrifice that I want to teach you in these types of positions. So let's say black plays g5, white drops the bishop back, both sides developing here. White also is expanding with the h and g pawns similarly to black. So bishop drops back to h7 and bishop to d1 with the idea of playing bishop c2 and to try to trade this very annoying bishop off. Now in these positions, you can play this move knight to e4, and let's say white follows through with his plan and plays this move bishop to c2. In a lot of these positions, you have this very, very cool idea of knight takes on c3. And this is a very, very important piece sacrifice. Now, b takes c3 cannot be played because there's bishop takes a3, and if bishop takes h7 happens, there's bishop c1. Black gets a rook on c1. That's not what white wants. So instead, what will happen here is that white won't take on c3. White will take on h7 instead. But now we go knight to a4, and now the bishop is still hanging, and the pawn on b2 is still hanging. Of course, white will try to save the bishop. Bishop goes back to c2, and now knight takes b2, and also pawn to b4. Now, we sacrificed the knight for a pawn initially. We took on c3, then we won b2, and now we are about to win a3 as well. And if a4 is played, we can even go b5, taking advantage of this pin. And by sacrificing our bishop in this case, or sometimes it's going to be the knight, we have gained two connected passed pawns on c4 and b4. And this is actually sort of a common theme that happens in these types of positions. And the problem for white is that white doesn't have enough time to bring the pieces over to the queen side in order to defend against these two pawns. So for example, if something like a5 happens, you can immediately just go rook a5. And if this trade happens, now you're not even down in material because you have three pawns for the bishop. And if white castles or anything like that, there's this move b3, and all of a sudden the pawns are going. Who's going to stop these pawns? If bishop to d1, there's knight d1 and then b2. So this is a very, very nice thematic sacrifice. It happens quite a bit in these types of structures. So try to remember this idea and try to use it in your games. Sacrifice your knight for the queenside pawns in order to create passed pawns on the b and c files. You might have heard me mention that knight to f3 is actually not a good move order for the white pieces, and that is because it allows resources such as queen to b6 going after this pawn, or knight to h5 going after this bishop. So if this is sort of an inaccurate move, what is the right way to play? Well, the right way to play is to actually, instead of knight to f3, it's to play knight to d2. And this is much better than knight f3. It's actually objectively, theoretically better than knight to f3. Because it stops knight h5, because it's not possible queen takes h5, just simply wins a piece. And also it mitigates some of the power of queen to b6, because you can go queen b3, and if they go c4, you can drop the queen back, and now all of the shenanigans with bishop to f5 no longer work, because you can just simply take it. And if black takes on b2, well, at least you can simply move the rook, but also you can just drop the queen back to b1. In the other line, instead of the knight being on d2, this knight was on f3, and this knight was back here on b1. So you didn't have this resource of queen b1. Now you do. So that means that the power of this queen b6 move in this move order with the knight d2 move order is mitigated somewhat. But this is actually not the only line that you can play. Instead of this, you can also consider something like knight to f3 a bit earlier, but you don't want to play c3. You actually want to go knight to d2 immediately. So you're not committing this pawn just yet. And the reason why you're doing this is because in a lot of lines, if black plays queen to b6, you're actually just going to take on c5, and if black takes on b2, now you're never playing c3 anymore. You're actually either playing c4 or rook to b1. These are the two main theoretical moves here. Actually, rook to b1 is the main line, c4 is the second line. These go into like forced sequence of moves, so I'm not going to go into depth here. If you are interested in this line, you can analyze it on your own. There's rook b1, as I said, there's c4. But the main thing that I want you to remember is that a very natural move order such as knight to f3 and c3 is inaccurate. You either want to play c3 and knight to d2, or you want to play knight to f3 and knight to d2 and not commit the pawn to c3 just yet. If the bishop goes to g4, then you can play c3 because queen b6 was not played. But if they go queen b6 immediately, you go here and you go c4 or rook b1. These are the two accurate move orders. Oftentimes in the London system, when your opponent does not play c5 and when they play something like, let's say, knight to c6 instead, in these types of positions, it's not really the best thing to play this pyramid system with e3 and c3. Instead, what you want to do here is you actually want to go for c4, and this is the best way to put pressure on your opponents. They might try something like knight to b4 here, but there's always queen a4 with a fork, so this kind of forces the knight to go back, and then there's c takes d5, and the game goes on from here. This is already a very, very nice position for the white pieces. Now, in these systems, you can choose to play c3, but this is okay. It's not necessarily the best thing to do because it doesn't put pressure on your opponent. Now, you're very solid and you're not losing, but it doesn't put pressure on your opponent. The same thing goes for systems when your opponents play c6 and they go for something like bishop to f5. So they also try to play the London system. And similarly, how c5 is the best thing to play against the London when you play c3. Against this setup, it's best to play c4 with white. And this is how you put the pressure on your opponent. And this also applies to positions when your opponents play f6, because with f6, they're preparing e5. So it makes sense to eventually go for c4 instead of going for c3, because after c4, if your opponents play e5, this loses a lot of potency because of c takes d5, and after queen takes d5, there's knight to c3. So you just win a bunch of tempi, the queen has to move somewhere, there's d takes e5, and then the bishop moves away, and this is actually already a winning position for the white pieces. So this is sort of a general rule of when to play c3 and when to play c4 instead. So against the mainline systems, when your opponents play knight f6 and c5, you play e3 and c3. Against these sort of sideline systems, when your opponents don't play c5, or after knight to c6 they can't play c5, in these types of situations, the best thing to do is to play for c4 instead. This is the most active way to play. When your opponent plays the King's Indian setup with g6 and then d6, in these types of positions, a common mistake is to put the bishop on d3. Now, you want to put the bishop on d3 usually in the London system, but not when your opponent plays the King's Indian defense. That is because in a lot of lines, this bishop, first of all, it doesn't do anything on d3 because it's looking at a fianchetto structure. It's basically looking at a brick wall. And also, oftentimes, it could become a target of e5 and e4. So for example, if you play something like knight to d2 here, there's e5, and then the bishop has to move, and e4 comes with a tempo, and it's also a fork, right? It just wins a piece and wins the game for the black pieces. So going back to this position right here, you actually want to play h3 first in order to stop any ideas of knight to h5, because if you go bishop e2, there's knight h5. This is the idea that we were talking about earlier. So that's why you want to play h3, create this getaway square, then most likely black will castle, and then you don't want to put the bishop on d3, you want to put the bishop on e2 when you're playing against the King's Indian setup. A very common tactical mistake that people make in these types of positions when the bishop goes out to g4 is that once you complete your pyramid right here, after e6, you can play this move queen a4. And this queen a4 move works when the bishop goes out to either g4 or f5 and e6 is played, so this bishop cannot retreat. And in this position, a very, very natural move is to play this move bishop to d6. This is an incredibly natural move, and it's actually the most played move in this position according to the Lichess database. And after bishop to d6, there's this very, very nice move, bishop to a6 for white. And this is completely winning because after a move like bishop takes f4, there is bishop takes b7 with a fork. And if you bring this bishop back, then white takes the knight with a check. The king has to move, and then white takes the rook. So in this position, you have won in exchange, and you're also up a pawn. So this is a very, very nice position for the white pieces. And there's not really a good way to defend against this bishop to a6 move. You can try something like rook to b8, but there's bishop takes b7 anyways, and after rook b7 there's queen c6 anyways. So this is still very good because after something like queen to d7 there's queen d6, and you're now up a whole piece and a pawn. Well, most likely you're gonna lose one pawn, but you're up a whole knight, and this is a completely winning position. So remember this very nice tactic with bishop to a6. There's another very common mistake that people make, and that is that they play queen to b6 too early. So if your opponents play knight to f6 here, you play c3, queen b6 is a very nice move after c3 has been played. But if your opponents play queen to b6 instead of playing knight f6 here. The thing is that you don't have to play c3. You don't even have to play queen c1 or anything like that trying to defend this pawn. You can play the most active move available to you, and that move is this move, knight to c3. And after knight to c3, the pawn is under attack. If the pawn is defended, there's knight to b5 with an attack on c7. And if you try to go e5, that just simply loses a pawn. So this is already completely winning because knight c7 is very, very difficult to stop. And if the pawn on b2 is accepted instead, now knight to d5 is winning. And after a move like e5, there's knight to c7. And the king is simply being hunted, and you can win this queen by playing rook to b1 if the king ventures out this way. So this is a very nice idea as well. Now, if you're struggling against the London system and you want to beat it, King's Indian Defense is one of the best openings to do that. So watch my King's Indian Defense video to learn plans and ideas there so you master that opening as well. And next time somebody plays the London against you, you're going to be very well prepared.